Please don't make me beg in front of everyone, Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper, and the words seemed to freeze the entire room. Before anyone understood what was happening, the wealthy ballroom had already chosen its side. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over polished marble floors. Soft music drifted from the string quartet in the corner, and every table in the elegant hall glowed with silverware, champagne, and the kind of confidence that made ordinary people feel invisible. But Nora Bennett stood there in a plain navy dress she had worn to 2 funerals and 1 church picnic, her hands clasped so tightly they trembled. She was the black maid who had worked in the Duval house for nearly 4 years, the woman who knew where every heirloom was kept, which flowers Mrs. Duval preferred in spring, and how Mr. Duval took his coffee when the world had not yet taught him to hide behind his title. Tonight, she had come only because the wedding planners needed one last set of hands before the ceremony began. She had stayed late to help smooth the linen, arrange the candles, and make sure the bride's mother never had a reason to complain. That should have been the end of it. Instead, standing near the head table, Nora heard her own name spoken like an insult. "You really brought the maid into the bridal suite?" one woman asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A few heads turned. A few smiles followed. The bride's cousin, dressed in pale satin and diamonds, looked Nora up and down as if she had mistaken the room for a service entrance. "This is supposed to be a private family celebration," she said, her tone sharp and amused. "Why is she still here?" Nora lowered her eyes, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had spent most of her life learning that dignity sometimes meant refusing to defend yourself in a room that had already made up its mind. She had worked since dawn, skipped lunch, and walked nearly 4 miles that morning after the bus she planned to take never came. Her feet ached. Her shoulders ached. But what hurt more was the way the room began to look at her, one glance at a time, as though her presence had somehow stained the celebration. "She was just helping," Nora said softly. "I'm almost finished." The cousin gave a short laugh. "Helping? Be honest. People like her always want to linger where they don't belong." The phrase hung in the air, ugly and polished, and more than one guest looked away instead of speaking. Nora felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her posture straight. Years of scrubbing floors, folding laundry, and swallowing insults had taught her that the world often mistook silence for weakness. It was not weakness. It was survival. At the far end of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the city lights, one man had not joined the laughter. Luca Moretti sat in stillness, his dark suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed on the scene with the sharp patience of someone used to being underestimated only once. He had arrived late, after a long meeting downtown, expecting nothing more than an evening of polite smiles and family politics. Instead, he was watching a woman in a service dress being dismissed in front of dozens of people who had no idea how hard she had worked to earn her place in that room, if only for a few hours. Nora did not know his name. She only knew that he had not laughed. He had not looked away either. And in a room where everyone else seemed willing to let her disappear, that single choice felt dangerous in a way she could not yet explain. For one suspended second, Nora could only stand there with her hands locked around the strap of her worn service tray, her throat tight and her face burning as the room waited to see whether she would fold. The laughter had not fully died. It lingered in the air like perfume that had been spilled too long ago, thin and sweet and impossible to ignore. A few guests lowered their glasses, pretending to study the reflections in the crystal while they listened for the next humiliation. Nora knew that look. She had seen it in kitchens, in back hallways, in places where people in expensive clothes decided that kindness was optional and dignity could be negotiated away by the people who needed their jobs too badly to protest. She had learned how to keep her chin steady when her heart was not. She had learned to keep breathing when every instinct told her to disappear. But tonight, with the warmth of the chandelier lights pressing down on her and the polished floor seeming to expose every flaw in her shoes, even survival felt like a fragile thing. Across the room, Luca Moretti finally moved. It was not a dramatic movement, not the kind that made heads snap around all at once. It was slower than that, more deliberate, as though the entire room had already shifted toward him before he even rose from his chair. His jacket remained smooth, his tie perfectly aligned, But there was something in the way his gaze locked onto the men nearest Nora that drained the color from their faces before he had said a single word. He set his glass down with careful control and walked forward, each step measured, unhurried, certain. The string quartet kept playing for 2 more notes, then faltered as if the musicians had sensed the temperature in the room changing. Nora looked at him once, then away, ashamed of how exposed she felt under his attention. She expected disapproval. She expected him to see the scene and quietly decide it was none of his concern. Instead, when he stopped beside her, his voice came low and calm, carrying enough authority to make the nearest table go silent. "Who told you to speak to her that way?" The man who had been smiling a moment ago suddenly found fascination in his cufflinks. The woman beside him straightened, her expression fixed in a polite mask that had already begun to crack. Nora held her breath. Luca did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room built on status, restraint could be more terrifying than anger. One of the guests let out a nervous laugh and tried to turn the moment into a misunderstanding, but Luca did not even look at him. His attention stayed on the people who had made Nora feel small, and the stillness in his face was worse than any shout. He asked for the name of the man who had mocked her. Then he asked for the name of the event organizer. Then he asked why a woman wearing a service badge was being treated as though she had somehow intruded where she did not belong. No one answered quickly enough. That was the first mistake. The second was assuming he was asking out of curiosity. Nora saw it then, the shift beneath his polished exterior, the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his life watching others underestimate the people they considered invisible. It unsettled him, clearly, but not because he was surprised by cruelty. He was surprised by how casually it had been allowed to happen. "She is here because she was invited," Lucas said at last, his tone almost gentle. "And if that invitation means nothing to you, then perhaps you should be the one to leave." The room went so still that Nora could hear the soft clink of a fork being set down several tables away. Her cheeks still burned, but something in her chest had begun to shift. It was not safety. Not yet. It was something rarer. It was the sudden, dizzying possibility that she had not been the only person in the room who had noticed what was wrong. A waiter paused mid-step. The organizer opened his mouth, then closed it again. No one wanted to be the first to challenge Luca Moretti in front of an audience that had already chosen a side and now seemed to be regretting it. Nora finally looked up at him, really looked, and saw not contempt, not pity, but the kind of attention that made a person feel seen in a way they had almost forgotten was possible. "You do not have to stand there alone," Luca said quietly, so only she could hear it. The words landed with such gentle force that her eyes stung. She had spent so many years being told to be useful, to be quiet, to make herself smaller, that the idea of standing in full view of everyone and not being humiliated for it felt almost impossible. Yet there he was, a man who owed her nothing, choosing to put his name, his presence, and his reputation between her and the people who wanted her to shrink. Somewhere behind them, the music started again, softer now, almost cautious. Nora swallowed hard and tightened her grip on the tray. She did not know what would happen next, only that the room had changed and that the change had begun with one man refusing to laugh. Nora stood very still as the music returned, soft and uncertain now, like the room itself had decided to lower its voice. Around her, the guests began to move again in small, careful motions, but the damage had already been done. She could feel every pair of eyes that had once been amused now pretending not to stare. Her fingers tightened around the service tray until the metal edge pressed into her palms, a tiny reminder that she was still here, still upright, even if the humiliation had nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Luca remained beside her, not touching her, not crowding her, simply there in a way that made the space around them feel different. When a server in a black vest hurried past, Luca lifted one hand and said calmly, "Take the tray for a moment." The young man hesitated, then obeyed. For the first time that night, Nora's hands were empty. It should have made her feel exposed. Instead, it made her feel strangely unburdened. Luca turned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. The long dining room glowed with warm reflections from the glassware and the silver centerpiece, but his attention never drifted. "Breathe," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. Nora almost laughed at the simplicity of it, because breathing was the one thing she had been doing all evening, and still it felt impossible. But she obeyed anyway, drawing in a slow, unsteady breath that seemed to steady more than her chest. Her eyes slipped toward the head table, where the people who had laughed earlier now looked as though they wished the floor would open beneath them. One of the women adjusted her pearl necklace without meeting Nora's gaze. Another guest reached for her wine and stopped halfway, suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become around Luca's presence. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. Nora had worked in enough rooms like this to understand that power rarely announced itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as stillness, as certainty, as the knowledge that no one dared interrupt it. "You are not a problem," Luca said. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that made her throat ache. Nora looked at him then, really looked, and saw something beneath the composed surface. A man who had spent too many years learning how to command a room and too few learning how to trust one. "I did not mean to cause trouble," she whispered. "I only wanted to do my job." Something in his face shifted, just slightly, as though her answer had reached a place he did not often let anyone see. "I know," he said. "That is exactly why this should never have happened." A silence followed, deep and complete. Even the music seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the faint clink of ice against crystal and the soft rustle of expensive fabric. Nora felt the heat return to her cheeks, but now it was not from shame. It was from the unfamiliar sensation of being defended in public without being made to feel weak for it. For years she had been taught that surviving meant keeping her head down, keeping her voice small, keeping her needs quiet. Yet Luca stood beside her as if her dignity mattered more than the opinion of everyone in the room. One of the older men at the table cleared his throat and looked away. Another lowered his champagne flute with a stiffness that suggested he was no longer comfortable with the laughter he had offered only minutes before. Nora noticed all of it, but what she noticed most was that no one was laughing now. Luca reached for the empty tray and handed it back to her with care, as if it were something valuable rather than ordinary. "Come with me," he said. Nora blinked. "Where?" "Somewhere quieter," he answered. "And somewhere you will be spoken to with respect." She should have said no. That was what caution told her. That was what experience demanded. Men with his kind of presence did not usually offer kindness without a price. And yet the way he said it, the way he looked at her as though she were not an inconvenience but a person, made her hesitate. Behind them, the chandelier lights shimmered across the marble floor, and every reflection seemed to hold the same question. Nora had come here expecting to survive the night unnoticed. Instead, she had become the center of a silence she did not understand. She took one careful breath, then another, and finally nodded. Luca did not smile. He simply turned and waited, making room for her to follow. And as Nora stepped away from the table, she felt the entire room watching, not with laughter this time, but with a stunned, uneasy stillness that told her something had already begun to change. Nora followed Luca through the quiet shift in the ballroom, her steps careful against the polished marble floor. The music had returned, but it no longer carried the easy laughter of before. It moved through the room like a held breath. Guests pretended not to watch them, though every face seemed turned a little too far in their direction. Luca said nothing at first. He did not rush her. He simply walked beside her with one hand at his side, calm and controlled, as if the entire room had already become part of his decision. Nora kept her eyes on the path ahead, trying not to think about how impossible this felt. 10 minutes ago, she had been just another woman in a black dress, carrying trays for people who would not remember her name by morning. Now every step felt like a test she had not agreed to take. Luca led her past a line of tall windows where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. The reflection caught his face in pale fragments, making him look even more distant and unreadable. Finally, he stopped at a side door near the end of the hall and opened it with one smooth motion. The room beyond was smaller, quieter, and lit by a single warm lamp that softened the sharp edges of the evening. A private sitting room. Nora hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether she was expected to enter. "Come in," Lucas said, his voice lower now, no longer carrying across a crowd. She stepped inside and heard the door close gently behind her. The sound should have comforted her. Instead, it made her aware of how alone she was with a man who could alter the temperature of an entire room without raising his voice. Luca crossed to the table near the window and picked up a glass of water, then set it down untouched, as though he had offered it only because silence needed something to hold. Nora remained near the door, still gripping the tray she had never set down. Luca noticed. His gaze dropped to her hands, then returned to her face. "You can let that go," he said. Nora looked down, realized her fingers had gone white around the metal rim, and slowly released it. The tray gave a faint, hollow ring as it rested against the wall. "I did not mean to cause trouble," she said. "I was only doing my job." Luca's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if he was hearing more than the words she spoke. "No," he said. "You were being spoken to as if your place in this room was something less than human." Nora looked away. She had heard worse before, in kitchens, in hallways, in places where no one thought she mattered enough to defend. That was what made this feel so strange. Not the kindness itself, but the fact that it had arrived from someone like him. Luca rested one hand against the back of a chair, still not sitting. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nora," she answered softly. He repeated it once, as if testing how it sounded in the room. Then he nodded. "Nora, tell me the truth. Did anyone force you into this work tonight?" The question startled her. She lifted her chin, cautious now. "No, sir. I needed the money. I always need the money." Luca studied her for a long moment, and in that silence Nora had the unsettling feeling that he was not merely observing her, but reading the tiredness she had spent years trying to hide. The lines at the corners of her mouth, the careful way she held herself, the shoes that had been polished but could not disguise their age. Every small detail must have told a story. "How long have you been working double shifts?" he asked. Nora almost laughed from exhaustion. "Long enough to stop counting." For the first time, something like surprise touched his face. It was gone quickly, but it was there. He turned slightly toward the window, as though the question had opened a door he had not expected to find. Outside, the city moved on in bright, indifferent streaks of light. Inside, the air was still. Nora could feel the old reflex in her chest, the one that told her to make herself smaller, to apologize for existing too loudly, to leave before anyone decided she had stayed too long. But Luca did not give her that chance. "Sit down," he said. Nora blinked. "I am fine standing." That was not a request. There was no cruelty in his tone, only certainty. It unsettled her more than anger would have. Slowly, she set one hand on the chair opposite him and sat on the edge, ready to rise if needed. Luca watched her do it, then finally took the seat across from her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt charged, as if the room had begun to understand something the rest of the ballroom had missed. Luca leaned back slightly, folding one hand over the other. "Tell me what happened out there," he said. Nora hesitated. The memory of the table, the laughter, the heat in her face, all of it rose at once. "It was nothing," she said automatically. Luca's eyes narrowed just a little. "Nothing does not look like that." Nora swallowed. For reasons she did not fully understand, his calm made it harder to lie. "They were making a joke," she admitted. "I did not think it mattered." Luca gave a slow, controlled nod. And then you stood up." The words came out softer than she intended. Luca did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its edge. "Yes," he said. "I did." Nora looked at him across the small table, at the stillness in his shoulders, the discipline in his face, the kind of man who seemed built from restraint rather than ease. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, she felt something else begin to rise. Not trust yet, but the first fragile shape of it. Luca reached for the untouched glass of water and slid it closer to her. "Drink," he said. "You have been standing in a room full of people who forgot how to treat you with respect. That kind of evening takes something out of a person." Nora stared at the glass, then at him. No one had spoken to her like this in years. Not with impatience, not with pity, just with the plain, startling force of being seen. She lifted the glass with both hands and took a small sip. The water was cool, almost shockingly so. Luca watched her over the rim, then spoke again, quieter now. "You should know something." Nora set the glass down. "What?" He paused, and for the first time since they had left the ballroom, he looked uncertain, as if the next sentence mattered more than all the others. "I did not step in because it was convenient," he said. "I stepped in because I have no patience for people who confuse wealth with worth." Nora's throat tightened. The words landed with the weight of a truth she had spent a lifetime hoping someone might say out loud. Outside the sitting room, the party continued in distant fragments of music and polished laughter. But inside, in the warm hush of that small room, the balance of the night had already shifted. Nora sat straighter without meaning to. Luca did not look away, and in the quiet space between them, something unfamiliar began to take shape, fragile as a match before the flame catches, but impossible now to ignore. Nora stayed in the sitting room with both hands wrapped around the glass of water Luca had given her, though she had barely taken a sip. The room was still quiet, lit by a soft gold lamp that made the walls glow instead of shine, and outside the door the distant music of the party drifted in and out like a memory, trying not to be noticed. Luca remained near the window, one hand in his pocket, the other resting loosely at his side, as if he had all the time in the world and no need to prove it. Nora could not stop thinking about what he had said. I have no patience for people who confuse wealth with worth. No one had ever spoken that way on her behalf before, not with that calm certainty, not as if her dignity was not a favor but a fact. She lowered her eyes to the glass, then looked up again when she heard him speak. You do not have to keep standing, he said. You can sit if you want. It was such a small sentence, almost nothing at all, but it undid something in her chest. Nora eased herself into the chair near the lamp, smoothing her skirt with nervous fingers. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was careful. She could feel Luca watching the room, listening to the muffled rhythm of celebration beyond the door, but when he turned back to her, his expression had changed. It was still controlled, still guarded, yet there was something older beneath it, something that looked like memory. You work here every weekend? He asked. Nora nodded. Yes, sir. Sometimes more if they need extra help. And they always speak to you like that. The question came quietly, but it made her throat tighten anyway. She gave the smallest shrug. Most people do not say it out loud, she answered. They only say enough for you to understand. Luca looked away for a second, jaw tightening as if he had bitten back a sharper response. Then his gaze returned to her, steady and direct. That should never feel normal to you. Nora almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. It had been normal for so long that she had learned how to survive inside it. She had learned to keep her face calm, her voice soft, her movements small enough not to invite trouble. She had learned that some rooms would always ask her to disappear a little more quietly than others. Yet here, in this room with a man she barely knew, she felt something unfamiliar rising behind her ribs. Not safety exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of being seen. Outside, a door closed somewhere down the hall. A burst of laughter rose, then faded. Luca reached for the small silver tray on the side table and set it farther away, clearing the space between them without making a show of it. Then he said, Tell me the truth, Nora. Did you come to this house because you wanted the work, or because you had no other choice? The question landed gently, but it landed all the same. Nora folded her hands in her lap. Her fingers were thin from too many long shifts and too few meals she had been able to sit down and finish. Both, she said at last. I needed the hours. I needed the money. And I needed to believe that one honest job could still be enough for someone like me. The words left her before she could stop them, and once they were spoken, the room seemed to hold still around them. Luca did not interrupt. He did not soften the truth or rush to comfort her with something empty. He simply listened, and somehow that made the confession heavier and safer at the same time. Nora took a breath and went on, her voice quieter now. My mother used to say that dignity is the one thing no one can take unless you hand it over. Luca's eyes lifted at that, his attention sharpening in a way that made her think he had heard a sentence like that before, maybe in another life, from another woman who had lived by it. He did not smile, but something in his face softened. Your mother was right, he said. Nora looked down at her hands again, blinking quickly because the kindness in his voice felt almost harder to hold than cruelty would have been. For years she had known how to endure being overlooked. She did not know what to do with being answered. Then Luca stepped back from the window and, without asking permission, moved the chair across from hers just enough to sit where he could face her directly. It was a simple movement, quiet and deliberate, but it changed the shape of the room. He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees, and for the first time Nora saw not the powerful man the others watched from a distance, but someone willing to come closer without taking anything from her. You should not have had to explain yourself to anyone in that ballroom, he said. Least of all to people who mistake titles for character. Nora let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing by a fraction. The words should not have surprised her, and yet they did. They sounded too honest to be strategic, too precise to be empty. For a few seconds, she simply looked at him, trying to understand why he made her feel both exposed and protected at once. Then, from somewhere beyond the door, the music shifted again, and with it came the faint sound of footsteps approaching the sitting room. Luca's head turned first. Nora felt the change before she saw it. The air seemed to tighten. The knock came once, measured and polite, and then a familiar voice announced from the hallway that there had been a misunderstanding upstairs and that several guests were asking questions. Luca rose to his feet without hurry, his face returning to that controlled stillness that had probably frightened more than one room full of important people. But before he opened the door, he looked back at Nora and said, "Stay here until I return." It was not an order spoken to place her beneath him. It was spoken like a promise to make sure no one else could push past him first. Nora remained in her chair, listening as the voices outside grew closer, and for the first time that night, she did not feel invisible. She felt watched over. And in a house built on wealth, status, and polished lies, that felt like the most dangerous change of all. Nora had only just begun to believe the night might spare her when the knock came again, sharper this time, followed by the low murmur of voices outside the sitting room door. Luca did not move at once. He simply stood beneath the soft gold lamp, his face unreadable, listening with the stillness of a man who had spent his life hearing danger before anyone else noticed it. Nora watched him from the chair, her fingers still wrapped around the glass of water, and realized that the room had changed again, not with noise, but with attention. Every sound outside felt closer now, every breath in the hallway heavier, as if the whole house were leaning toward the door to hear what would happen next. When Luca finally opened it, two men in dark suits stood in the hall with careful expressions and too much respect to be casual. One of them spoke first, quietly, telling Luca that the guests downstairs were uneasy, that someone had seen Nora leave the ballroom with him, and that questions were beginning to spread faster than anyone could manage. The other man kept his eyes lowered, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders, the kind that came when people feared they were standing too near the center of something they did not understand. Luca listened without interruption. Then he thanked them, in a voice so calm it made the hallway feel even smaller, and closed the door with deliberate care. For a moment he remained there, one hand resting on the brass knob, the other at his side, before he turned back to Nora. "You are not going back out there tonight," he said. Nora looked up at him, uncertain what to make of the firmness in his voice. "I did not ask to cause trouble," she said, her own words barely above a whisper. Luca's gaze held hers, steady and direct. "Trouble was already in this house before you arrived," he replied. It was not the answer she expected, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if he had sounded angry. She lowered her eyes to the water in her hands, then admitted what had been pressing against her chest since the ballroom. "People like that always see me before they see what I can do," she said. "They hear my shoes, my accent, the way I hold a tray, and they decide who I am before I speak." Luca's expression changed at that, only slightly, but enough for Nora to notice. He stepped away from the door and crossed the room with the quiet precision of someone who never wasted movement. When he stopped beside her chair, he did not sit. He simply looked down at her, as though he were trying to understand the shape of a wound that no one else had bothered to name. "And what do you think they miss?" he asked. Nora almost laughed, but the sound never came. Instead, she stared at the water for a long second before answering. "That I have spent my whole life learning how to survive rooms that want me smaller than I am." The silence that followed was gentle, but it carried weight. Luca's jaw tightened, not with anger at her, but at the truth she had spoken so easily. Outside, the party continued in fragments, a distant swell of music and faint bursts of conversation. But in here, time seemed to slow. Luca reached for the chair across from her and sat down at last, folding one hand over the other, as if he were choosing every word with care. "Then tonight," he said, "you will not make yourself smaller for anyone." Nora looked up so quickly that the water nearly slipped from her fingers. No one had ever said that to her like it mattered. Not with pity, not as a gesture meant to sound kind, while leaving everything unchanged. Luca said it, as if it were a fact the world had failed to understand. Nora felt something inside her loosen, something old and tired and guarded. She did not know what to call it, only that it frightened her in the quiet way good things sometimes do. Before she could answer, there came another sound from the hallway, this one softer, almost hesitant, followed by a woman's voice asking whether Mr. De Luca was receiving visitors. Luca rose in one smooth motion, all softness leaving his face at once. He looked toward the door, then back to Nora, and for the briefest second she saw the conflict he kept hidden from everyone else. The man who ruled the room, and the man who had just told her she did not have to disappear. "Stay where you are," he said quietly. Not harshly, not as a command, as protection. Nora remained seated, listening as his footsteps crossed the floor, and the voices outside resumed in low, careful tones. The room felt smaller without him near the window, yet somehow safer too, as if his absence had only made his promise more real. She stared at the brass frame of the door, heart beating too fast, and wondered what kind of life could begin in a house where a man like Luca De Luca looked at her as if she belonged in the center of the story instead of the edge of it. Then the doorknob turned again, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Nora had only just begun to believe that the worst of the evening had passed when the door opened again, and the air in the sitting room changed at once. Two of Luca De Luca's men stepped in first, followed by a woman in a tailored navy suit carrying a slim leather folder against her chest. She was composed in the way only people from powerful families seemed to be, calm enough to make the room feel smaller without raising her voice at all. Nora straightened in her chair, suddenly aware of the water glass in her hands, the soft lamp glow on the table, the expensive silence of the house around her. Luca remained standing by the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, his expression unreadable now. The woman looked from him to Nora and then gave a slight nod, as if she had already understood more than she should have. "Miss Nora Hayes," she said, her tone respectful but careful. "I am Elena Bianchi. My family has worked with the De Lucas for many years." Nora felt her stomach tighten. She had never been introduced to someone like this in her life, as though her name suddenly mattered in a room where it had once been convenient to ignore her. Luca did not speak. He only watched, silent and still, while Elena opened the folder and placed a single folded document on the table. "There are some things," Elena said quietly, "that should be explained before the rest of this night is allowed to continue." Nora looked at Luca, then back at the paper, unsure whether she should reach for it. The room seemed to lean in around her. Even the men at the door had gone motionless, their eyes forward, their faces blank in the trained way of people who had learned not to show surprise. Luca finally moved, crossing the room in a few slow steps until he stood beside the table. He did not touch the document. He did not look at Elena. He looked only at Nora. "You deserve the truth," he said. His voice was low, steady, and so quiet that it made her listen harder. Nora's breath caught. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of something she had not been offered in a very long time. Truth was not usually given to people like her. It was withheld, shaped, delayed, used as leverage. Elena folded her hands in front of her and continued. "Your father, Daniel Hayes, worked for the Bianchi Shipping Company 15 years ago. He was not just an employee. He was the man who uncovered what our accountant had been doing behind closed doors." Nora blinked, her mind struggling to follow. Her father had died when she was young, and most of what she knew about his work had come in fragments from her mother, who spoke of long hours, small paychecks, and a pride he never allowed hardship to erase. Luca's gaze did not leave Nora's face as Elena went on. He reported it quietly. He did it the right way. He believed someone would listen. Nora's fingers tightened around the glass. There was a softness in her chest now, sharp and painful, the kind that came when an old memory suddenly found its shape. Luca spoke at last, his voice carrying a restraint that seemed hard-won. He was ignored. Elena gave a faint nod. "And after that, your family was left with very little support. The records were buried. The man who should have protected your father chose convenience instead." Nora stared at the folded document as if it might explain the rest of her life. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, and even to herself her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Luca answered before Elena could. "Because someone here tried to make you feel invisible." His eyes held hers. and in them she saw neither pity nor amusement, only a cold kind of understanding that somehow felt warmer than either. And I do not allow that in my house. The sentence settled over the room like something final. Nora did not know what to say. She had spent years learning how to make herself small, how to take the edge out of her own voice, how to become useful enough to keep, quiet enough to tolerate. But here, in front of this man with his calm eyes and impossible silence, all of that seemed to have loosened. Elena gently slid the document toward her. "This is a letter," she said. "A copy of what your father wrote after everything happened. It was found recently, kept in storage for years." Nora looked down at the paper and then, with a hand that trembled only slightly now, unfolded it. The room became so still that she could hear the faint hum of the lamp beside her. She began to read, and with each line her expression changed, grief giving way to shock, then to a strange, aching tenderness. Luca said nothing. He simply waited, as if he understood that some truths had to be received in silence. When Nora finally reached the end, her eyes shone, but she did not cry. She pressed the letter carefully back into her lap and looked up at the man who had brought her here. "You knew this before tonight," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the beginning of understanding. Luca's jaw tightened slightly. "I knew enough to look closer," he said. "Not enough to forgive what had already been done." Nora let that settle between them. Outside the room, the sounds of the house had faded into a distant murmur, as if the rest of the world had stepped away to give her this moment alone. For the first time, she did not feel like someone waiting to be sent away. She felt like someone being seen in full, and the power of that realization nearly overwhelmed her. Elena gathered the folder and stepped back toward the door. "I will leave you both," she said softly. "The rest can wait until morning." Luca did not move to stop her. His eyes remained on Nora, attentive, unreadable, and in that charged quiet, she understood something she had not dared name before. The night had not brought her safety simply by chance. It had brought her to a threshold, and on the other side of that threshold was a man powerful enough to change her life, but careful enough to let her choose how to enter it. The morning light had barely begun to touch the tall windows when Nora heard the soft knock at the sitting room door. She rose at once, smoothing her dress with hands that still felt unfamiliar to her, and when Luca stepped inside, the whole room seemed to tighten around him. He looked less like a man entering a house and more like a storm that had learned how to wear a suit. His expression was calm, but there was something deliberate in the way he held himself, as if every step he took had already been measured against a future no one else could see. Nora searched his face for any sign of regret, any shadow of doubt, but found only that steady, watchful attention he had given her all night. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. His voice was low, careful, almost gentle, and the question alone made her chest ache with a feeling she did not yet know how to name. "A little," she said, though both of them knew it was not much. Luca nodded once and glanced toward the hallway before looking back at her. "The house is quiet now," he said, "but quiet does not always mean safe." Nora lowered her eyes, and for a brief second the room felt too small to hold what had passed between them the night before. She had spent so long learning how to take up as little space as possible that being noticed by someone like him still felt impossible, like standing in a doorway too grand to belong to her. Yet he kept looking at her as if she were not a mistake in his world, but a truth he had finally decided to face. A soft movement in the hall drew his attention, and a moment later Elena appeared again, her navy suit immaculate, her folder tucked neatly under one arm. She offered Nora a polite smile, then turned to Luca with the composed efficiency of someone used to carrying difficult news without letting it show. "Everything from the guest list has been reviewed," Elena said. "There are still 2 names that need to be confirmed before noon." Luca gave a quiet nod, but his eyes remained on Nora. "Handle it," he said. Elena's gaze shifted briefly to Nora, not unkind, but measuring in the way that made Nora instinctively sit straighter. Then, to Nora's surprise, Elena closed the folder and said, "There is no need for you to leave the room." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight Nora had not expected. She looked from one face to the other, unsure whether she had heard correctly. In her experience, rooms like this were always divided by invisible rules, and women like her were usually expected to stand at the edge until they were dismissed. But Luca only pulled out the chair beside him, and placed one hand lightly on the back of it, not touching her, only giving her the choice. Nora hesitated, then sat. The chair felt sturdy beneath her, real in a way the last 24 hours had not. Elena opened the folder and began speaking in a calm, practical tone about schedules, arrivals, and arrangements for the evening reception, but Nora soon realized that the conversation was no longer about the event alone. It was about who would be allowed to stand near Luca when the room was full. It was about what the family would tolerate, what they would question, and what they would never say aloud until the doors were closed. Nora listened in silence, her fingers folded tightly in her lap, while Luca answered each point with the same controlled patience. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. Yet every word he spoke carried the quiet force of a man who had already decided that no one would arrange his life without his agreement. When Elena finally paused, Luca turned toward Nora. "You do not have to understand all of this today," he said. "I only need you to understand one thing." Nora lifted her eyes to his. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Nothing that happened to you last night was acceptable," he said, each word measured and clear. "And nothing about your place here will be decided by people who never bothered to know you." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, not with anger, not with pity, and certainly not with the kind of certainty that made apology feel too small a word. He was not promising her an easy path. She could see that now, but he was offering something far rarer than comfort. He was offering respect before she had earned it in his world, as if her dignity had never been up for debate. Outside, somewhere beyond the windows, the estate was waking slowly, but in the sitting room time seemed to pause around the three of them. Elena quietly gathered her folder and stepped back, recognizing the shape of a private moment without needing to be told. Nora remained still, staring at Luca as if he might vanish the instant she looked away. Instead, he reached for the cup of coffee cooling on the table, set it gently within her reach, and said, "Eat something when you are ready. There is no hurry." It was such a small kindness that it nearly undid her. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, and ordinary kindness from a man like Luca De Luca felt more fragile and more powerful than anything she had ever known. Nora looked down at her hands, then back up at him. For the first time, she understood that the life waiting beyond this room was no longer a threat she had to survive alone. It was a choice she might have to make, and that frightened her almost as much as it steadied her. Luca noticed the change in her expression and said nothing, only watched with that same unreadable patience as she breathed through the moment and held herself together. And in the quiet that followed, Nora realized that the most dangerous thing in the world was not fear. It was hope. Nora had spent the last hour learning how silence could feel heavier than noise. It settled over Luca De Luca's house in layers, beneath the low murmur of staff in the hall and the distant hum of a city that never seemed to sleep, until even the air in the sitting room felt charged with expectation. She stood near the window with her hands folded tightly in front of her, looking out at the pale morning light spilling over the stone terrace, while inside, every polished surface reflected a version of her she was still not certain how to recognize. A woman who had arrived trembling and unsure now stood in a room where decisions were made with a single look. Behind her, the soft sound of footsteps made her turn, and Luca entered without hurry, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that made everything around him seem slightly less real. He did not carry the restless energy of the night before. Instead, he carried stillness, the kind that came from a man who had already decided something and was only waiting for the world to catch up. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable except for the faint warmth that had begun to live there whenever he looked at her. "You did not sleep," he said quietly. Nora gave a small, almost embarrassed shake of her head. "Not much." Luca studied her for a moment, then glanced toward the table where the untouched coffee had gone cold. Without calling for anyone, he crossed the room, poured fresh coffee from the silver carafe, and brought it to her himself. The gesture was simple, almost unremarkable, but it struck her harder than any grand promise could have. No one in her life had ever made care look this effortless. "Thank you," she said, taking the cup with careful fingers. His eyes rested on her face, then moved to the paper she had been holding since dawn, the one with the address of the small apartment she had been considering, the one she was supposed to visit later that day if she decided to leave quietly and disappear back into the life she had known. Luca saw it, and something in his expression shifted, though only slightly. "You are still thinking about going," he said, not as a question, but as if naming a weather pattern he had already watched form on the horizon. Nora lowered her gaze. "I do not know what else I am supposed to do." "That depends," he said, his voice calm and low, "on whether you want a place to hide or a place to belong." The words settled between them with unusual weight. Nora looked up at him then, surprised by the directness of it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The house around them seemed to pause. Somewhere far down the corridor, a door closed softly, and the sound felt strangely distant, as if the world outside this room belonged to someone else. Lucas set his cup aside, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small folded envelope. He did not place it in her hand right away. Instead, he held it between them, patient and composed, giving her the dignity of choosing. "This is not charity," he said, "and it is not pressure. It is an offer." Nora stared at the envelope, then at him. "An offer for what?" "For a new beginning," he said. "If you want one." She did not move. Her breath seemed to catch halfway in her chest. The fear that had followed her for so long did not vanish, but it changed shape. It no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a door. And standing before her was a man who had not forced it open, only waited beside it. Nora took the envelope slowly, as if the paper itself might tremble under the weight of her decision. Inside was more than money. There were documents, an address, and a handwritten note in Luca's careful, deliberate script. It was not long. It did not need to be. It simply said that a position had been prepared for her if she wanted it, a place where she would be safe, respected, and free to decide the life she wanted to build next. Her fingers tightened around the note as the room blurred for just a moment. No one had ever offered her safety without asking her to shrink in return. No one had ever spoken the word respect as if it belonged in the same sentence as her name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and this time her voice did not break. Luca looked at her for a long second before answering. "Because last night," he said, "you stood in the middle of a room that was never meant to hold kindness, and you survived it with more grace than most men I know would have shown. Because you did not ask for pity. Because you deserve more than survival." The words hit her like sunlight through a closed window, quiet but undeniable. Nora looked away, blinking hard once, then again, because if she let herself feel all of it at once, she was afraid she would fall apart. Luca did not rush her. He only stayed where he was, steady as stone, letting the silence do what it could not. At last, Nora drew a breath and looked back at him. "If I stay," she said, "I need to know it is because I chose it." Something softened in Luca's face, something few people would ever have noticed if they had not been watching closely. "Then choose," he said. And in that instant, the room changed. It was no longer a place where she had been hidden away from the world. It was the place where she had first been seen clearly, and the fact that he understood the difference made her chest ache in a way she had no name for. Nora set the envelope against her palm, then slowly nodded. It was small, almost invisible, but it was the first decision she had made in years that did not come from fear. Luca saw it, and for the first time, the man who had seemed made of iron let a quiet relief pass across his face. Not triumph, not possession, relief, as if he had been waiting not to win her, but to witness her becoming. Outside, the city moved on with its usual noise and indifference, but inside that room, something irreversible had taken root. Nora was still afraid, and Luca still carried his own shadows. But between them, there was now something neither of them could ignore. Trust, fragile as glass and twice as precious. The house remained silent for another long moment. And in that silence, Nora finally understood that the most dangerous thing had never been the life she was leaving behind. It was the possibility that, after everything, she might still be brave enough to begin again.